shining a light on good practice for people who believe there's a better way to work.
Good afternoon and welcome to radio show number 604. How do employees really feel about internal communication in 2025? Today we're going to be talking about the IC Index 2025. I'm Jo Dodds, your host for today. I'm an engagement consultant working within the Engage for Success core team. The Engage for Success movement is an inclusive movement committed to the idea that there is a better way to work by releasing more of the capability and potential of people at work. We spread the word about employee engagement and shine a light on good practice, inspiring people and workplaces to thrive. And we're widely supported across the UK, involving the public, private and third sectors. If you go to our website, which is engageforsuccess.org, you can use the link at the bottom of the page to join our newsletter list, and all our social media links are there too. So my guest today is Jennifer Sproul, who's Chief Executive of the Institute of Internal Communication. Welcome, Jennifer. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks, Jo. Lovely to be here.
And this isn't your first time, is it?
No, I think it's my second, but I'm still reveling in the fact that this is episode 604.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it? I can't believe we've been going for so long when podcasting's so sort of, still up and coming, as it were, and we've been going since 2012. So yeah, very exciting. So start by telling us who you are, what you do, and a bit about the Institute of Internal Communication.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you kindly described, I'm the chief executive here over at the IoIC, and sort of, I guess, my fundamental role is to drive the work of the Institute forward, working with our board of trustees that represent internal communication leads and functions across a range of industries and sectors, from public sector to utilities to storage to all sorts. And my job is really to move the Institute forward, but also represent and advocate for the role of internal communication, its importance and its impact in organisations.
Lovely. Thank you. So we're going to be talking today predominantly about the findings from the IC Index 2025. Let's start by telling us what that actually means, what it is, how it happens, when it happens, all that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So the IC Index is a report that the IoIC launched working with Ipsos, Carrion and Box. Our first report was in 2023. So and so now today, obviously, we're talking about the 2025 one. But essentially, we created and deliver this report to understand the experience of communication from the employee. So this research report looks at a representative sample of the UK workforce, nearly 5,000 of them, across industries, sectors, working types, working situations, to actually understand what they're looking.
Oh, I think you might be muted.
Oh, when I'm.
I thought I'd lost you.
I'm back.
You're back, yes. Do that bit again.
Yes, so sorry. So the IC Index was launched in 2023 with the goal to understand the communication experience from the employee perspective. So it's a survey of a representative sample of nearly 5,000 UK employees to understand how is actually the communication experience landing for them, and what more do they need to actually fundamentally drive the outcomes that the organisations are looking for, and how can we therefore also help guide our practitioners and those in our profession to deliver to those goals.
Lovely. So let's talk about this year then. What's stood out most for you?
Yeah, so as I say, it's in its third year, and we try every year to keep sort of a consistent bank of questions so that we can sort of look at the trends, and then we add in new ones. And I think the thing that's fundamentally stood out this year is where we've dug much more into what makes a 10 out of 10 internal communication experience for the employee. And fundamentally, only 13% said they experienced a 10 out of 10. But that's not necessarily the interesting statistic. What we were asking was, well, what makes 10 out of 10? What does that feel like? What does excellence feel like? And what really stood out for us, if you want to get to that point, is two main areas for organizations and practitioners to work on. Is they're looking for more connection and they're looking for more care. So when you think about what makes a 10 out of 10 experience, it's where people feel like they work for an organization where they feel heard, where they feel that their feedback is welcomed, that their leaders understand their experiences, understand what they're asking for, that there's a certain amount of empathy and inspiration and leadership visibility. So fundamentally, what takes internal communication to excellence, which then drives engagement and trust and all those things, is having connection and care. And with that, employee voice, I would say, of the 4 enablers.
That's a nice tie-in, isn't it?
I thought so.
Lovely. And so, so let's talk a bit more about that connection and care and what that does that look like. I mean, when you ask the question, do you ask for sort of examples of people telling you what they mean by connection? Are they giving you examples of that? I'm not sure how the survey works.
Yeah, so fundamentally it comes from, obviously we ask quite a number of quantitative questions that are phrased in a way that makes sense to the employee, not that makes sense to the internal communication or engagement professional necessarily. And then what we do is at Ipsos to do quite a clever bit of analysis to look at, if someone says, I feel like my employer, for example, you'll ask the question, rate from 1 to 10 how you feel your employer communicates with you. So someone will answer or rate that 10, and then we'll go and look at all the other questions that they're asked around, do you feel you're heard? Do you feel you can give your views? Do you feel your feedback is acted upon? What kind of traits and tones and types do you want from your leader? What sort of tonality? And you cross-correlate all of that information back to a 10 out of 10 experience. And the fundamental things where it changes is when they've responded positively to how they feel about their leader and how they feel about listening and how they feel about feedback.
And how does that compare to previous years? You said that this is the third year, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. Excuse me. So in terms of previous years, I think we've never drilled into so much that 10 out of 10. We're not seeing fundamental, but we're seeing movement in certain areas. Like leadership is getting a bit better. We are seeing that people feel that there is certain ways where they understand the strategy. Belief is a different thing. But where we're not seeing particularly any movement, which is why we drilled into this, when we ask on the issue of listening and feedback, it's not moving necessarily. And now we've quantified this year differently how intrinsically important that is to employees then becoming an advocate and feeling engaged and feeling they have trust. So what we've done differently this year is make that correlation. And I think on all the years that we've been doing the index so far, we're still not seeing listening is moving up slightly, but feedback is very, very stagnant for 3 years as an action point, as in closing that feedback loop.
And have you got some thoughts around what organisations can do differently to do that, to make that change?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things as well we did this year with the report was we shared the findings with some of the fellows of the Institute who are doing the job, if you like, to kind of give us some feedback and give us some suggestions on, well, if this is the big issue, how do we go about it? And I think there'll always be dependencies on your organization, the culture, your leadership style. But fundamentally, I think there's 2 things that we need to be working on. Is one, how we coach and support our leaders. So how can we get leaders out there to actively listen, to want to dial up active listening, to make sure there's more regularity of moments, and therefore then of our managers, and how are we developing those listening programs? So are our leaders going out and being listened to? Are they asking for views? What are we doing on our social channels? What are we doing with our managers? What are we doing? All those key points of an employee journey where listening can happen. And then from a perspective going, well, when we've listened, how are we collecting that information talking that through in terms of what we're able to do with that and making sure there's a feedback loop. So I think that fundamentally the things that we need to be looking at is how can we coach and support our leaders, and how we building good listening and feedback programs in our organizations.
And how do you sort of see that split between the sort of more formal programs and the sort of day-to-day stuff? Because a lot of organizations do, employee surveys and ask questions, and then there's often a whole sort of process and program and everything else to feed that back and take some action as a result of it. But then you've also got the sort of day-to-day talking and listening to your people that managers and leaders are doing on a more ad hoc basis. How do you see those two things sort of fitting together?
We asked in this as well, when we think about how people listen, where do they feel that there's the best forum they want to be listened to, and what does that impact on their feeling of their organization? And obviously it's not one or the other, it's all of it. And obviously size of organization really matters. So for example, but when we asked of the types of listening that make the biggest impact to you as an employee to be an advocate or to recommend your organization as a great place to work, it's in the smaller moments. So for example, one-to-one sessions, online listening sessions with small groups, focused internal social media discussions. Reverse mentoring came up as one of the most impactful things to do for listening. So what it shows to you is that the formal stuff happens, and that's all great, and there's an engine around it. But when they feel truly listened and heard to, it's more how do we blend in those smaller micro moments and what those can happen at that kind of level, why it is harder to achieve perhaps in such large organizations. So I think it's not one or the other, it's all of it. But from an employee perspective, more personal, feels more real.
Yes, yeah. And it's interesting you say sort of reverse mentoring as an example, because I'm not sure sort of leaders would generally think about that as being a listening opportunity. But actually, when you start to sort of unpick it and think about what does it look like, you can see exactly what it would be. Are there other things like that people are doing and could be doing that are part of that informal sort of feedback loop that perhaps people wouldn't think about immediately?
Yeah, absolutely. There is more informality in ways you can do things that you're seeing in some organizations. So, for example, yes, a reverse mentoring, you could argue, is kind of a formal process, but also as well, things around leaders that make sure they're really present in enterprise social networks, or really listening or tuning into the organization and responding in a more conversational tone. IoIC really believe that connection and conversation is really, really fundamental. I think other good things that you're seeing in some organizations is when roadshows and when you go out, or when you open yourself up for one-to-one sessions, or you're talking with key influencers. So it's how do you show up every day, and how do you put in some smaller moments? I've seen, for example, one leader who makes it their remit every morning to get up, to go onto the social chat with employees, recognize, see well done, or tune into what's going on. To others where I've said, I'm going to look at our app and make sure I go out there and put a personal message, or say, does anybody want to speak to me directly, offer out one-to-ones. It's really hard for a CEO to balance that with their times, but those where you can build that sort of, I guess, open door policy and dialogue, that conversational.
Yeah. And it's interesting as well how much of this stuff is in the leader's sort of power to put in their diary on a regular basis, on their to-do list, and what, that sort of consistent approach, the effect that will have.
Yeah, I think that's important. Consistency builds trust, is when we feel you're consistently honest with me, consistently have a dialogue with me. There's a consistent touch point, and there's small moments and big moments. I think storing things up for formality of annual surveys, not saying to get rid of those, doesn't feel like that's a real listening culture.
So trust, engagement and advocacy are recurring themes. What are the most effective levers from this year's index that leaders can use to strengthen those areas?
Yeah, I think from a trust point of view, the fundamental thing that we're seeing is leaders are the third trusted, direct managers are trusted above them, and then their most senior team. So in that regard, when we look at the trust aspect, the most effective thing that we're seeing is we've asked employees what tonality and what style of leadership communication helps them feel that sense of trust. And we're seeing certainly positivity, words around inspiration, words around honesty, transparency. Tell me like it is. I think the world feels really out of control. The world around us feels really out of control. It feels sometimes quite dark. We're not looking for false hope, but we're looking for a real honesty about the implications for that of the organization. So when we're thinking about the trust, it's about making sure that you are being inspiring and honest and real. And I think that's that realness that's needed in the way. So it's about the tonality, the language, the style that we use that does that. And I think also with the trust piece as well, what we see really is the kind of piece that makes it feel better is when leaders or organizations come with that kind of big news piece or that strategy piece where they're looking for people to come on that sort of trail with them, is to reflect back what that means to the employee. They don't feel like their challenges are factored into that narrative. So it's reflecting back, I know this is difficult, or I know you're struggling with this, and here's the solution to X, and we're doing this because of Y. So I think it's all that sense of being real in unreal times is what that sort of the trust linchpin is. In terms of engagement and advocacy, it does definitely link into much more so what we're doing around listening and feedback and what we're doing around values and purpose. So, for example, one thing we've seen this year is that 62% of people say they get their identity from work. So how are we doing on that side of things?
Interesting. And so let's think about some sort of practical things that organizations can do. So, people don't always have lots of funding and lots of budget to do lots of things. But, what I mean, we've already talked about some of the informal stuff is really helpful already. But, if people were listening and thought, now, right, what can I do? What's going to have a really high impact? What could they do tomorrow to improve, communication engagement?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing from a listening perspective, the first thing I would look at is rather than what more do we need, I'd look at what do we have already in place, informally and formally, because listening and dialogue and conversation happens every day, all day at work. So where are those touch points that I can be linked into? How can I support conversations in those moments? And how can I gather the feedback from those touch points so that I can understand what's top of mind for employees? I think get out. I know it's limited, but if you can get out and just be visible and listen and observe to what's going on and tune into those conversations where they happen, that can be a really good start point to kind of focus in on what more is needed rather than trying to add more that you perhaps don't have the capacity to run on a more formal basis. I think the other piece as well for me is around the trust piece and around the leadership piece. That's already happening. So what are we doing with the way we're talking? How are we coaching others? How are we messaging? How are we writing? How are we talking about the strategy? How are we keeping people informed regularly, honestly, transparently? So for me, I wouldn't be trying to add more. I'd be looking at what already happens and how could I improve those situations, from whether that's how our leaders or line managers communicate or how I make big communications feel relevant and understood and understandable and shared meaning, to what are the moments of listening that already happen that I could tap into and collect information from to make sure that we are playing that back in our continuous communication.
So how important is it that we sort of tell employees that we have listened to them? So, we listen and we do things as a result. Do people feel listened to because they see those things happening and changes happening? Or do we also have to sort of make sure that, we articulate how we're listening and what we're doing with that information and that sort of thing? Just thinking about, you're asking those questions of people, how do they feel, do they feel listened? Yeah. Is it important that we tell them how we're listening to them, or is it the proof's in the pudding sort of thing?
Closing the loop is the fundamental key to driving those engagement scores, those trust scores, those advocacy scores up. So when you welcome feedback, for example, in the index this year, so if you take an organization that says they don't listen and they don't feel that it's fed back, their likelihood to recommend or say they're a good place to work is about 23%. When you just listen, it's 63%. But when you listen and you close the feedback loop, it jumps to 90%.
Wow. Massive difference, isn't it? So more generally, communication and the industry and where the profession's going, tell us more about that. Internal communications wasn't always separate, it was part of personnel back in the day and all that sort of stuff, or marketing internally, or all sorts of different definitions and so on. It's very much a profession and has been for a good long while now. Tell us a bit about how that sort of developed and where you think it's moving towards.
Yeah, absolutely. And IoIC, we have been around as an institute since 1949, which was brought in as industrial editors back then, who understood the need to place a focus on communication and dialogue to really drive the organization forward. And that was obviously through in-house journals and magazines. So it kind of established itself as a very much a broadcast function. And there's some people that I think in the profession today still feel like they're not seen differently to that. But where I say we are now and where we're going, and particularly with the evolution of AI, particularly with the evolution of technology and the way we can cut through and noise overload and attention deficit, but also with the way that the organizations, I think, are working in really difficult, fast-paced, transformative times, is we're moving beyond that kind of we're here just to tell people stuff to we're here to actually create an environment and a culture and a place of work where communication is effective at every touch point, that embodied communication. So as we move forward, how are we driving a function that has the requisite skills, roles, and tactics so that we are making sure fundamentally we're creating shared meaning and shared understanding, so we're all pointing in the same direction, to how it then engenders an environment where transformation can happen, where the culture can thrive, where trust takes place, where adoption happens. So I think it's much more moving to that kind of human-centered, human-led approach to communication at every touch point, and how that employee experience feels in that way, and how we can support that through beyond more so than perhaps the informative aspect of where perhaps internal communication originated from.
And where does it happen in organizations in terms of their sort of development, that you go from being a small organization where you wouldn't have a specific internal comms function to then very much having that? And I guess it will vary by industry and all that sort of stuff, but how does that work for an organization as they grow and then they decide they need that specifically?
I mean, it does vary. I would say that what I know is typically once you get over 1,000 employees, that's when you're more likely to see a dedicated internal communication person. But internal communication happens in every organization, whether that's from 2 people to 50,000. It's the fundamental thing. And also the IC index shows actually internal communication is more effective in the smaller organizations than the larger organizations by the volume of things that we're trying to achieve. So, and I think that for us as IoIC, we're looking very much at the future of internal communication and where that goes, because there's been so much that's changed and continues to change in terms of how work is done, how work is conducted, the pressures that businesses are under, the trends that are happening. So how do we then make sure that as organizations grow in size, that we're building those requisite skills into one people and or a function of people? So we have, for example, the profession map where we look at people from, starting at level 1 in their career up to leading an IC function of level 4. But I would say from an employee's perspective, you are more likely to see internal communication sit within another function if you've got a smaller employee base. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't be looking to acquire or skill up in the area of internal communication, even if it's part of a smaller remit, part of a bigger remit, I should say.
And so people coming into the profession, how does that happen? You know, do they join an organisation that has this department, if you like, and that's how they get into it? Or are you starting to see people wanting to forge a career right from university in this area?
There's still more work to be done there, I would say. So, for example, at IoIC, we run a campaign called I Chose IC. So we're doing an incredible amount of outreach at the moment, work where we're going into universities, social mobility charities, different charities and organisations, where we're going in and we're speaking to people of school age, undergraduate age, and also sort of postgraduate age, to explain what a career in internal communication could look like and how that goes. And we're trying to build into working with partnering with universities to see it much more represented on academic syllabus, or at least reference that it's a pathway you could take it, because it is still a relatively unknown career path. And we know from our work with our members that most people fall into it predominantly from a journalistic, or they've been in HR or another function and they've moved in that direction. We are seeing more people take on junior roles, but that is an area that we'd like to see increase, really, that kind of pathway and that program. And we did a piece of research earlier in this year where we asked the community about their professions, and what they want is more clearer pathways, more clearer ways of progression. And obviously we're providing that through our development pathways, but getting the employers to build those from the ground up is kind of that long work that we're in for, really.
And you mentioned AI earlier. How's that impacting you know, roles and how things will develop as time goes on?
I think when AI first came, you know, the launch of ChatGPT and OpenAI, which kind of created this kind of rush at it, if you like. I think there was initially a lot of worry about how do we use AI in the work of communicators in terms of content creation and doing that. And I think we're still playing with it, right? So we're still trying to work out, because you need to be really mindful of the risk of AI as a communication vehicle, depending on your outcome. So how can we use it as an assistant to help us think things through? But fundamentally, humans resonate with humans. So where does it play to a benefit and where does it play to a risk? So I think we're still playing with it, but also as well, what's the opportunities with the AI, for example, in creating more personalized experiences, because we can work much more cleverly with data, being able to analyze our data. For example, those large-scale listening programs, if you do things securely and robustly, AI can really help with some of those areas. So I think we're still trying to understand how the human-led tech-enabled relationship works for the practice of internal communication. I think more so where there's and the index also has some data around how employees feel about AI, and it mirrors many other research report that's out there at the moment that says that generally employees are fearful of it. They don't understand it. They're not comfortable with it. It's a risk of jobs. I think we're past that necessarily impact of AI on our jobs, but we're still trying to work out how it works with our work. But I think the bigger work that organizations really, really need to lean into internal communication professionals for is, what is the organization's AI narrative? This is a huge workplace transformation change initiative. And many employees don't understand what the organization's narrative is and where they're leading it. We've done our own ethics charter, which we worked through a group of a task force earlier this year, which really gives 9 good principles for it. But I think ethical AI adoption is still a lot of work to be done. And so for me, yes, there are challenges in our practice, but when I think about our purpose and what we're there to do for organizations, this is a huge area where we could be offering organizations much more guidance on how they go about it.
Lovely, thank you. And we're just coming up to the end of our half hour. Where can people find the report?
Yeah, absolutely. It's on the IoIC website. It's fully, you don't have to keep your data. There's no forms. You can just download it. If you go to the IoIC website and go to the Knowledge Hub and search for the IC Index, you'll find it, and you can just download the full PDF report off our website.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks so much for your time today. It's been really interesting.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Lovely. And just to let you know, next week, Jo Moffat will be back, and she's talking to Gary Keogh, who's a leadership coach, and they're talking about psychological safety.
Engage for Success Radio, raising the profile of employee engagement and shining a light on good practice for people who believe there's a better way to work.